Okay, cool. So this is a deep learning framework for neuroscience. Uh, as you can see, it's like a huge kind of collaboration. Some notable names here. Surya Ganguly, he's at Stanford. This guy is actually crazy. Like, if you just look at his publications, he like started out in like string theory and doing astrophysics. Then he moved to like deep learning and then neuroscience. He does some crazy stuff. Also notably, obviously, Yoshua Bengio, kind of a forefather in deep learning. Um, yeah, he also has a couple other publications on biologically plausible neural nets. Uh, and then Timothy Lillicrap, he seems to basically be on almost all these biologically plausible neural net papers. He is also sort of like the lead author on the previous paper that you guys voted on, um, the assessing the scalability of biologically motivated deep learning architectures. That one, he sort of led that. It seems. So yeah, those are the sort of the names that stand out to me here. Yeah, who else? Someone has just joined. Yeah, Lucy. Okay, so yeah, deep learning framework for neuroscience. Basically, this title, I think it's pretty straightforward, right? It's basically proposing a framework for neuroscience, right, in which we can like look at neurological structures and whatnot through deep learning, which refers to like the field of machine learning that has to do with deep neural networks, which we will get into. And as you can see, it's published in Nature Neuroscience, so this is definitely more towards a neuroscience audience. It's not for a machine learning audience. So that's why we won't see as much math necessarily. There is a bit of math here, but it is, again, talking about how we can approach neuroscience through a like deep learning based model, not the other way around. So, so yeah, abstract, right? Systems neuroscience seeks explanations for how the brain implements a wide variety of perceptual, cognitive, and motor tasks. Systems neuroscience, again, it basically just means how we can model neural circuits and those neural computations that perform all of these via like some kind of like with like some kind of formal definition, whether that's mathematical or whether that's with artificial and like machine learning, as we'll see here. Um, and then AI, right? Like we all know what AI is. Artificial neural nets, they sort of break it down into these three components: objective functions, learning rules, and architectures. So this isn't really like a God-given, like written in stone three components, but I think it is a useful trifurcation, I guess, of the ideas in deep learning and ANNs that will allow them to model neuroscience, like these neuronal systems more effectively. Um, and right, like deep learning has been really powerful. It's sort of fueled this entire revolution in the past few years for facial recognition, like chatbots and so on. They're saying that we can use these deep learning components to analyze like systems, like problems in systems neuroscience, like neuronal circuits and whatnot. And then they show that this optimization based framework, like referring to deep learning, right? Because the way deep learning works is that we optimize those neural nets. This optimization-based framework can drive theoretical and experimental progress in neuroscience. And we'll get a look at what current neuroscience works like at the moment, and then how like deep learning adds to that. Um, so yeah, there have been technical advances recently in our ability to observe and manipulate brains. I think they're mainly talking about like uh, the light stuff. Like what's it called again? Uh, neuropixels probes and whatnot, right? Like there's also the thing where you put certain proteins that fluoresce when they're activate, like when their neurons are activated into like the brain. And that lets you track these activations much more effectively. I think that's mainly what they're talking about here. And since now we have this much more wide scale data about how the brain activates and whatnot, how can we use this to develop models of the brain? Right? So in the classical framework, a researcher would observe neural activity, develop theories for like individual neurons, and then they would come up with like a circuit kind of explanation of those neurons. So for example, with pattern generators, they're like a specific type of neural circuit that is involved in virtually all rhythmic movements. So whether that's walking, um, uh, walking, I don't know, clapping. We can look at this paper later if you want, but the point is that there are specific neural circuits that neuroscientists in this classical framework would analyze to try to understand how they work. But these classical frameworks don't really scale up to these thousands of neurons, right? And since they haven't had, they really haven't had success in these huge circuits like in the neocortex or hippocampus, right? Neocortex notably being what like humans allows humans to do our complex high-level logic, and hippocampus, which is where we sort of store memories. That's the usual way it's sort of thought of. These classical frameworks don't allow us to analyze these huge networks effectively. So they propose that we start using artificial neural networks, right? Because artificial neural nets are like they basically approximate these huge networks exactly how you would expect them to. And at their core, ANN's model neural computation using simplified units that loosely mimic the integration, right? They're vaguely like real neurons, right? There's like different ways. There's like different layers of abstraction, right? Some are very similar to, yeah, some are very similar to like actual neurons with like spiking behavior and whatnot, and others can just be like simple linear operations that like do linear algebra, right, between each layer. So in this framework, they do not seek to summarize how a computation is performed, but they do seek to explain how, like looking through a deep learning lens, right, with those three components that we talked about earlier, how that would enable us to learn these like high-level computations. And yeah, in terms of ANNs, right, they do train themselves, but there are like these three components are what like the human deep learning person sort of defines, right? The learning goal is like the loss function, right? Like how do we show the neural net what it's supposed to learn? This is usually called the loss function as well. A set of learning rules, right? This is basically just gradient descent. But there are like, when you actually train a neural net, usually you'll use like the atom optimizer. Which is like similar to gradient descent, but it does it slightly differently. Those are like different learning rules, right? And then the network architecture, which is what you're probably most familiar with, like how do we structure our neural net so that it can learn most effectively. So yeah, three core components of ANN design, right? You have the objective functions over here, which is like this will look very familiar if you've seen like a gradient descent visualization, right? As you vary on these two, like the X and Z axes, like the synapse 1 and the synapse 2, or like weight 1 versus weight 2 in your in like a deep learning context, how does the actual objective function change? So on this y-axis, we see like the accuracy or the accuracy of the actual neural net, right? So based on how we change our parameters or the synapses, how will our overall loss function change or our objective function change? And then second component, right? These learning rules, you have the actual objective function gradient, right? Like which is like the actual correct way towards the maximization of the objective, or in gradient descent, right? We want to minimize the loss function. So it would be the opposite of this with the same idea. The objective function gradient, the objective function gradient points in the exact direction that we want to go in, but our learning rule update might not go exactly in that direction. And that's to avoid certain things like the local minima problem that you might have learned about in like neural net theory. If there are any questions about that, then I can go in more in depth. But yeah, the reason why the learning rule update might not be the exact same as the objective function is due to like a variety of theories in like theoretical problems in deep learning. Interestingly though, like recent papers have shown that local minima actually are not that important, and most deep learning problems are quite smooth in that you don't have to do these kinds of learning, like stochastic learning rule updates. You can literally just go in the direction of the gradient And usually in most deep learning contexts, you'll be fine. That's another sort of interesting paper, but it is more like machine learning side, not really, and it is really math heavy. But yeah, so architectures, right? This is the third component. Here you have like a simple feed forward network. Here, I'm not sure what the name, like it looks almost like a hop field network, but you have this like input and output. I guess this is arguably like an attentional layer. Here you have like an autoencoder, right? Like where you're compressing it into this internal latent space. And then here you have a recurrent neural net where you put it through this through these layers, and then one of the outputs comes back in. Or wait, yeah, I mean, yeah, it is some type of recurrent neural net because you have like feedback. Any questions? Yeah, I mean, like we don't have to. I think I basically explained this. Any questions on this so far? Whether it's this or like this or the abstract. Okay. So deep learning can be seen as a rebranding, right? Like blah, blah, blah. And they're talking about layers in the sense of being analogous to brain regions, not specific laminae, which I would assume are like, there might be actual layers in brains, right? Which sort of constitute, like I know in the occipital cortex, or like the part of your brain that does visual computations, right? They have these like very specific layers that correlate with specific visual operations. So I think they're like in this paper, they're saying layers are better generalized to entire brain regions rather than those specific laminae. Here they talk about, right? So like recently deep learning has become much better because we have like these GPUs that can do these hugely parallelized operations. And those parallelized operations are useful because it means that we can compute sections of these neural nets at the same time, right? Like we can compute the these, like, because they're basically matrix operations. So when you do it on a GPU, you can compute all of those matrix multiplications at the same time for each of these feed forward operations. So that's why ANNs have become much better. Obviously, ANNs have deep learning has solved a lot of these problems. Yeah, blah, blah, right? They can these like various behavioral and neurophysiological phenomena have been shown to emerge in ANNs, right? So when you train, for example, a convolutional neural net to recognize cats versus dogs, it'll start recognizing, like in certain layers, it'll start recognizing circles or squares, and so on. So these like neural nets have these emergent properties that sort of mimic the hierarchical structure of like of neuronal circuits as well. Yeah, so then this is the other thing, right? This is the original paper that we were going to look at. Like many modeling studies have shown that backpropagation seems biologically implausible. But in this paper, they're actually saying that, is that over here? Oh yeah, over here they're saying, yeah, it isn't as, oh yeah, this is the sentence I was looking for. Third, many modeling studies have demonstrated that the apparent biological implausibility of end-to-end learning rules, such as learning algorithms that can mimic the power of canonical backpropagation of error algorithm, is overstated. They're saying the biological implausibility is overstated. If you take all of these various kind of neuroscience ideas as assumptions that would be in, like we assume that they are present in neurons, then backprop-like learning actually does become plausible. Yeah, so ANNs aren't as unrealistic as previously thought, but the paper that we were going to look at earlier shows that, like, based on current, like it sort of backs this up in the sense that backprop is much more powerful than any of the proposed biologically plausible algorithms so far. So yeah, over here, I looked at this graphic earlier. I don't really see the purpose of this here. It's basically, yeah, it's basically talking about bias versus variance in the weight changes. So like it's showing various different learning rules, right? So you have error backpropagation, um, which is like the standard thing, right? Like this is what we use in PyTorch or TensorFlow backprop. And then there's all these other proposed biologically plausible algorithms, and they're showing how like some of these are have more randomness in their weight changes, whereas others are have much more tendency to like overfit. So I think that's what they're trying to show here. Yeah. So now with these developments, it's the right time to consider deep learning inspired approaches to like neuroscience, right? Since we can also monitor these huge neural populations, right? Like all of these neurons at the same time, we can effectively model deep learning in a neural context. Any questions up till this point before we jump into like a little bit of math? Am I going too fast or is the pace fine?
It's good.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty good.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, so here they have a bit of math, right? This is basically just talking about let's see. So suppose we have an objective function f of w, right? This is like going to be our loss function. And then we have the weights, right? The current parameters. If we update the weights, right, from w to delta w, right? Like this is the new weight. Then the change in performance is going to be this delta f. F of w plus delta w, right? Like this is the new weights, right? Like this is going to be the performance, like the new performance after we perform the update minus the old performance. So that's what we have. That's what we call this delta F, the change in performance. And if the changes are locally smooth, right, then we can approximate them by taking the gradient, right? And the way we compute that is the transpose of delta W. Whoa, the transpose of delta W. Like the weight change, right? Like our actual weight update, dot producted with this gradient with respect to W of f of W. So basically this is saying the local area of the objective function around the current weight values, right? We can get the gradient of that. That's again like this, right? That's like this red line, right? The actual gradient direction. If we take the dot product of that with the weight changes, right? And we have to take the transpose of this, so it's the same dimensionality. If you take linear algebra, this will make more sense. If you take the dot product of these, then you'll get the actual change in performance. Yeah, and then here they explain like the notation. We know that there is an n minus, oh yeah, suppose we want to guarantee improved performance, right? We want to make sure that it's always going to be greater than 0. Then they basically choose a small step size, right? And then they take the same gradient, right? And then they basically say, we want to have this change in performance f, right? This delta f, and it's going to be approximately equivalent to the step size times the transpose of that first thing that we computed times itself, right? Untransposed. And we're basically saying that the objective function value increases with every step according to the length of the gradient vector. So this thing is basically the gradient vector, like the length of the gradient vector. So yeah, that's basically what it's just saying here. We want to ensure that this entire thing is greater than 0. And then the credit assignment problem, they talked about this a bit earlier. It's basically saying which synapse or which parameter should be updated based on the loss function. And then the standard way to do that is with backpropagation, right? We use the chain rule to go back through our entire network and calculate the gradients of we calculate like the updates, like how we should update each of those parameters. Yeah, so that's the idea in this little box. Any questions on, any questions on that math stuff? Yeah. Might be a bit confusing if you haven't done much deep learning stuff before. Okay. Okay, cool. So now they start talking about how we can actually like quantify these, the accuracy of these kinds of models. So yeah, so earlier, like 20 years ago, right, they said that AI should be primarily concerned with the tasks that humans can perform effortlessly, right? Perception and control, but also like long-term prediction, reasoning, and planning, and etc. This is termed the AI set, right? Because that's what we like currently as a field, that's what people think that AI should be able to do. Yeah, the much of the success of deep learning can be attributed to the consideration given to learning in the AI set, right? Uh, when you're training ANNs that are well suited to these specific tasks, you have to provide these inductive biases. Inductive biases are assumptions that one makes about the nature of solutions to a given optimization problem. So they have like a list of those later on. Like for example, hierarchy is like one really big inductive bias. Like certain things should be composed from smaller ones, right? Like phonemes are summoned into words, words into sentences, etc., etc. So our ANN should have the ability to deal with these hierarchical structures. So deep learning doesn't only rely on increases in computational power, it also requires these inductive biases and this emergent computation, like we were talking earlier about like convolutional neural nets with like that shape recognition and whatnot. So the set of tasks that neuroscientists want to improve, want to be able to model is what they're terming the brain set, right? So the tasks that are important for survival and reproduction for that species, basically that's like analogous to the AI set. We suspect that it'll be crucial to the development of deep learning framework for systems neuroscience to focus how a given animal might solve tasks in the appropriate brain set, right? So we should like this paper is basically like formalizing these ideas. It's saying that we can, if we can model a species brain using an ANN that's able to perform well on its appropriate brain set, that would be good. Like that's what we should try to do. Here, inductive bias, right? Like they have a list of these somewhere here, like yeah, hierarchy or like convolutions, right? These are also sometimes called like priors, right? So Yoshua Bengio has this really interesting paper called the consciousness prior, which talks about how like if we take consciousness as like an inductive bias, as like an assumption in our neural net architectures, it will allow us to more elegantly explain certain things like attentional operations. So yeah, here's like, these are a bunch of different inductive biases, more concretely. So here, okay, yeah, any questions up to this point? Cool, cool. Okay, I think we should probably be done in about 10 minutes. These seem like a lot of sections, but honestly, we've already covered like the meat of the article, I think. These are just sort of going in depth, and each of these are like pretty small. So yeah, again, they have those three components: objective or loss functions, the learning rules, and the architectures. We already talked about most of those, right? Like cross entropy loss, that's one objective function. You might also have like mean squared error loss and so on. Learning rules are how the parameters in the model are updated. In the standard way we do that is like backprop plus gradient descent. We use backprop to decide the actual updates that should be made, or like the direction of the updates for each parameter, and then gradient descent decides like to what extent each of those should be updated. Blah, blah, right? Supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and RL they all need to use these learning rules in the same fashion. Architectures, right? It's like how we actually arrange these. Yeah, so then over here they ask this kind of question, which might be like kind of natural if you're coming from that classical systems neuroscience perspective we talked about earlier. Why do AI researchers focus on these high level 3 components rather than designing these specific computations? And like the short answer is that it's just like really pragmatic, right? In the past 15, more like 10 years, right, we've seen that when we create these really big deep learning neural architectures, they turn out to be, and they just like throw a ton of data at them, they turn out to be very effective at solving problems like image classification and so on, much more much more effective than the old like expert systems that were originally designed in like the 50s and 60s, when they believed that we could like piece together these logical elementary computations, and it turned out that like those kinds of algorithms were pretty bad at what they were doing. But now in the past few years, Yoshua Benji also has a really interesting talk about this system 1 to system 2 deep learning, that like we need to like, oh yeah, I mean this sentence is sort of different. Yeah, over here they're basically saying like deep learning is like, or like pre-designed computations are like too difficult, and like doing these high level things is good. But in addition to this, I think somewhere else it might say in this article, recently there's been like this consensus in deep learning that we need to bring back some of those like symbolic, like logical kind of operations. We can't just do everything with these like huge linear algebra machines. We do need some of those like elementary computations. We do need some of those inductive biases in order to have effective learning mechanisms. So yeah, again, right? The computations are difficult to interpret when you have like billions or maybe even trillions of parameters. You don't really know what they're doing internally, right? Like these millions of weights, we don't know what it's doing. Again, this is like another reason why we want, like why researchers want to bring back in those like symbolic computations to a certain extent, because they're much more interpretable. And like in certain cases, like self-driving cars, right? You wouldn't want to have this huge neural net that you don't know how it's going to react to the environment in like very specific scenarios. Maybe like sometimes when it sees a pedestrian who's wearing like a red hat, for some reason, it decides to like run them over. And you wouldn't know that because it isn't this like elegant symbolic kind of model that you can look at and understand what it's doing. Right, so with these small circuits, you can do those classical kind of things, but with these bigger ones, we do need, they suggest that we do need these ANN models. Yeah, so they're not claiming to predict neural responses with a compact model, but they're rather explaining the emergence of neural responses within a compact framework, right? So the overall structure of how the brain learns and whatnot, they're going to be able to explain with this this tripartite ANN framework. Yeah, like environment or data, right? Like, is that considered a fourth essential component? How do they answer this? They say yes, it's relevant, but like basically, we're trying to, like, the core issue they're explaining here is like how to develop models, right? So the model itself, you can sort of dissociate from the data in this paper, right? Like, a good model is one that should be able to learn effectively regardless of the data that it's thrown at. Not necessarily completely regardless, right? But it should be able to learn something. Like if there is a structure to the data, a good model should be able to learn that kind of data. What is the architecture of the circuits, right? Right, they say they agree. Circuit level descriptions are crucial for system neuroscientists, but they'd rather argue that architecture is not sufficient for we would argue that understanding the architecture is not sufficient for understanding the circuit. Yeah, rather it should be complemented by knowledge of learning rules and objective functions. Yeah. So basically what they're saying here is that you can't understand a neural circuit just by looking at the structure of how the neurons are connected to each other. You also have to know how those neurons are learning and like what they're learning against, right? So identifying the objective functions is hard in comparison to those other two. Neuroscientists tend not to think about those. Right, so there's several objective functions that have been proposed for the brain. We'll look at those in a bit. They're not advocating for any one of these specific objective functions. They're just saying that objective functions are part of the bigger story. And over here, you can see how when there's different approaches to this, right? Like you can have learning rules that follow a gradient completely, which is what just like plain gradient descent would do. Or like you can like not follow the gradient at all. And obviously in this scenario, you wouldn't learn anything. And then this is something like, this isn't stochastic gradient descent because you can see how there is still clearly a structure to this. Stochastic gradient descent, it would be like sort of all over the place, but this is still like partially following the gradient. And this is useful because again, like the local minima problem and various other ideas, we don't want to follow a gradient exactly because we can like fall into traps sort of in this like high dimensional objective function curvature. Wait, objective function, what's the word? Yeah, sure, we can call it curvature, whatever. This optimization framework has an added benefit, right? The architecture is learning, like they're relatively simple and compact in comparison to, like if you were actually to go and list out each of those neural computations, it would be kind of hard. But it's easier to explain these with these higher level ideas, like those three things, right? And they're sort of just like repeating a lot of what they've said here. Right, like they want to explain high level theories. Yeah, so researchers have long postulated objective functions, right? But they've sidestepped the question of hierarchical credit assignment, which is really important in deep learning, right? Usually, again, we use backpropagation to do that. But that other paper that you guys voted on, right? That's really dealing with this hierarchical credit assignment problem. What are biologically plausible ways to assign credit to neurons? Here they're asking, are there objective functions in the brain? Animals clearly have some baseline objective functions, right? Like you want to make sure that you like maintain blood oxygen levels, you maintain some internal temperature and so on. They say that like certain loss functions, right? Like cross entropy loss, it's unlikely to be used in the brain since it requires a specification of the correct category for each sensory input. So they're basically saying like certain objective functions are probably more biologically plausible and some aren't. But again, I think the really interesting problem is like the credit assignment problem here, not necessarily the objective function. I'm sure this is probably more of an interesting question in neuroscience. How do we know what a neuron is training against? If things don't get better according to some metric, how can we refer to any phenotypic plasticity as learning as opposed to just changes, right? So they're basically taking an almost philosophical argument, right, that you have to have an objective function at some level because otherwise they're just like changes, right? So in the wet lab, how can this framework articulated here engage with experimental work, right? They want to say that these models of the brain should be able to solve the brain set. They should be informed by like our knowledge of anatomy, and they should also be able to explain these like changes that we observe in the brain. Checking that a model can solve a given task is straightforward, right? But the latter two aren't necessarily that tractable. So over here they have like this interesting kind of graphic comparing deep ANNs to the brain. Over here you have like a ANN, right? You have this input, you go through all these layers, and then you have this objective function, and then after that you use this learning rule to go and update each of these. Right, we could use a deep ANN, blah, blah, blah. And then when examining the orientation tuning of the populations in different layers, yeah, the largest changes in tuning should occur higher in the cortical hierarchy, right? So the reason again, like they're emphasizing this like high level modeling that ANNs would be able to do. I'm sure the ANN might not be able to say like what some precise neuron is computing, but it should be able to say like our largest changes in tuning should occur at the in like the latest layer when we're training for some specific task, or when we've given or like when we're given some set of data to train the brain on, right? And then we propose it, we like prompt it with some new like data. Uh, our model might be able to say, okay, this layer 2 should be activating most. And then, right, you can, these are like experimentally testable predictions, because now you know, now you can compare like neural activity to what they're actually able to do. Interesting kind of excerpt, or any questions up till this point? Okay, interesting kind of excerpt here. I have a friend at MIT, and what she is working on is basically using this entire like this broad framework of using ANNs, right? Like deep learning networks to approximate like brain activations. She's using that for using GPT-3, right? Or actually GPT-2, like OpenAI's language generation model, in order to predict activations in like the language parts of the brain. So they've actually found that there's a pretty close correlation, like with just a simple linear model, you can predict how the language regions of the brain will fire in comparison, like based off of how the neural activations in your GPT-2 model fire, which is really interesting, right? And that's sort of a concrete test case of this, of like what they're performing in this, of what they're proposing in this paper. So now these next three sections are pretty short. Empirical studies of architecture, right? So we'll look at architecture, then learning rules and objective functions. Right, there's a lot of effort already underway to describe the anatomy of the nervous system. There's quite a bit of work in this, right? Like we know that representations in the striate cortex better match early layers of deep ANN versus blah, 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 right? So we know that there are certain correspondences between like structures in the brain and like architectures of our ANNs. So, right, we would want to create ANNs that have an architecture more similar to how to like structures in the brain, and that'll allow us to like better model those parts of the brain. Right, there's already a ton of work here in this like architecture stuff. So like let's look at learning rules. I think that's probably more interesting. Right, these studies in the past in neuroscience have rarely explored how credit assignment occurs, which is like very core to ANNs. So there have been like concrete proposals, right, on like some concrete proposals on how neurons might learn, right? Like apical dendrites. This might be an interesting paper to check out, how those might be involved in credit assignment, and so on. But it's very important, they're saying here, for experimentalists to measure neural responses so that we can capture how representations evolve during training. Because then I think if we're able to do that, then we can compare that with our ANN models and say like the way this section of the brain is learning is very similar to this other ANN model. And like they're saying that neuroscientists should focus more on turning their focus towards learning rules, like credit assignment, rather than just like broad ideas in learning rules. This again is a super interesting kind of graphic, right? Let's look at the thing over here. So attention-based models of credit assignment, right? There's various different ways that we can assign credit, right? There's this reward prediction errors that determine the direction of the plastic changes. Right, so if they activate a particular output unit, they get tagged for attentional feedback. So like these the ones that are labeled T get tagged, and then later on we have this neuromodulator that actually goes through and updates those parts of the brain, and some become stronger, some become weaker, right? Like this unexpected reward and unexpected punishment. But they only affect these like tagged sections. Right, and this provides an estimate of gradient for category-based objective functions. And then here are like dendritic models of credit assignment. So like in one of these, like the first one, feed forward weight updates are determined by a combination of feed forward inputs, and there's a delta. Yeah, when we present it with two different stimuli and only one is reinforced, then we can then at least like concrete predictions, right? So when the rat sees like this or whatever, then it receives water, I guess, and then we can see how actually in the neurons, this one learns, right, and this one doesn't, because this one is associated with like receiving water and this one isn't. And then we can actually measure the activations in these dendrites and see how they change over time. Oh yeah, so like with this one, right, like the one that has been trained, if we now prompt it with like the original kind of stimulus, it'll activate a lot. Whereas if we prompt the other one that wasn't trained with a stimulus, it won't activate that much. Yeah.
Wait, how do they measure the activation of the dendrites?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we can look at this paper, right? Dendritic cortical microcircuits approximate the backpropagation algorithm. No, I should have opened that in a new tab. Okay, wait, right. Okay, yeah, as you can see, we're almost done with this, by the way. We can take a quick look at this. How do they measure this? Or let's come back to this, but that's a very good question. I agree.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So yeah, basically, yeah, I mean, any other questions on this? Okay, cool. So right, they're talking about learning rules. I think that is probably the most interesting thing here, and it is sort of related to what we saw in the previous paper, or not the previous paper, the other paper that was proposed for the reading meeting today, of like biologically motivated learning rules. Empirical studies of objective functions, right? They're saying like there isn't really too much work in this before. It seems. Ethology may provide guidance as to which functions it would be useful for animals to optimize. I'm not sure what ethology is. Yeah, what is this? Yeah, I have no idea. We can take a look at that as well. So they're trying to like there's also work trying to relate experimental data to objective functions. Right, so this is probably the most important thing, like comparing ANNs trained on natural scenes to neural activity that's observed in the brain when they like see certain scenes. That is, I guess that's an approach to objective functions. I'm not sure exactly how. I don't really get this one. Again, this is like more of a review paper almost in a sense. Like it has links to a ton of these interesting articles that would be cool to look at. Oh yeah, here, this is another thing I wanted to talk about. So another newly emerging approach asks what an animal circuit can optimize when controlling a BCI, right? Thus, blah, blah, growing literature allows us to explore what happens in the brain. But this thing is super interesting. So I'm not sure it's this paper, learning by neural reassociation. I don't think it's this one. It came out a bit more recently, but they showed that rat brains or something, or actually no, I think it was humans, like humans with like a BCI implant, right? Like therapeutically, within like 1 to 2 weeks, their brain had already rearranged itself to a certain extent to optimize its like input and output flow with like the BCI. So like all that would feel like to the user, right, is just like, oh, it's getting easier to use this, like I'm getting the hang of it. but internally, when you think about it, it's really like your brain is rearranging itself around the brain computer interface. So that might be a really interesting way to investigate objective functions, right? Like if we can somehow like with an external BCI, we can predefine our own objective functions, um, and then sort of propagate that into the actual subject's brain, and then we can see how their brain changes based on those objective functions. Uh, oh, it's 3:50. Okay, let's just skim through this real quick, and then we can. Okay, so one may argue that it focuses on architecture, blah blah blah. Right, they're heavily informed by this knowledge of like they're basically saying that they're not departing completely from systems neuroscience. They're still like building on that. Um, right, a lot of this computational neuroscience is focused on like the specific dynamics of neural activity. But here they're talking about just like overarching kind of things that we would be able to predict, because they no longer want to deal with these like tiny neural circuits. They want to make predictions about these huge sections of the brain, like parts of the neocortex and whatnot. So you can no longer deal with these like tiny dynamics. You want to be able to observe these high level functions. Here they're also saying like some animals seem to like have instinctual abilities, right, that are like hard coded into their brain. They're basically saying that this innate behavior is just learned on evolutionary timescales, right? It happens in a different manner in a sense, right? Like they aren't learning via objective functions. It is almost like genetic programming, or what is it called? Like uh, evolutionary learning. I always forget, there's like a couple terms related to this, but certain genes that correlate with specific neural circuits or structures might get selected for. So they're saying that like these behaviors are learned over time, and these hardwired behaviors are best described as like inductive biases, and we still should be able to account for those in our ANNs. Yeah, so they're basically saying that objective functions are really core here, and our models should be able to explain function optimization. Right, they're just addressing various concerns posed by people who are more entrenched in like classical systems neuroscience. Oh yeah, this is another interesting thing. Some people might say that like the huge number of parameters in ANNs is a violation of Occam's razor, and it's like overfitting, right? But they actually show that there are intrinsic mathematical properties and these like emergent structures in like neural nets that allow them to have really good generalization. And there's some like super interesting works on this as well, of like extracting symbolic models from neural nets. Those are super interesting papers. I enjoy reading that kind of work because it shows that like regardless of how neural nets might look like a like weird black box, there's actually a structure intrinsic to it that it just learns, because that's the optimal way to solve the problem, right? Like some problems might be solved by just like overfitting, but usually there is like an optimal intrinsic structure to problems that makes them easier to solve when you have those kinds of mathematical properties. Right, conclusion, they're basically saying that, just repeating the same ideas, we can use ANNs to approximate these huge, like million, billion size like neuron populations in the brains. Right, like Hebbian mechanisms explain biological data, but they should be designed with objective functions and architectures in mind, because currently they're like sort of they're sort of used in like neural circuits, from what I understand, sort of dissociated from like the grander view, which is what they're trying to explain in this paper, and so on and so on, right? So if we consider research data within the framework provided by this mindset and focus our attention on these three essential components, we can develop theories of the brain that will reap the full benefits of current technological revolution in neuroscience. So yeah, that's about it. I think this paper again is like very much of a review, especially if you don't have as much experience uh, with back propagation, deep learning, and so on. I think this would definitely have been like a good paper to review those kinds of ideas before we dive into anything more complicated about like biologically plausible deep learning. Um, so yeah, are there any other kind of questions before we just take a quick look through this? Cool. Questions about anything? Um, Opinions? What do you guys want to talk about next week? I mean, okay, did you guys enjoy this paper more or last week's paper?
I think definitely this one.
Okay, cool. What about the rest of you?
For me, I gotta say last week's paper was a bit more interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's definitely this huge bifurcation in neurotech, right? With like brain computer interfaces on one side and like computational neuroscience on the other side. Um, and they're sort of like inverses of each other. Some people prefer one side, some people prefer the other. Um, I guess we'll find out based on the results of voting this coming week on like papers. But yeah, I mean, do you guys want to pursue more of this computational neuroscience type of stuff, or do you guys want to go more into the brain computer interface side of stuff, or something else? I mean, there's like lots of potential paths we could take. Okay, let's take a look at this real quick. Did Google just add this, by the way? This did not used to be here. That's pretty cool. Okay. Uh, all right, whatever. So dendritic cortical microcircuits approximate the backprop algorithm. How do I zoom now? Okay, there we go. Mm, okay, let's look through methods. Um, I feel like it would be in an appendix somewhere on like how they actually measured these. Uh, okay, maybe it's earlier on. Let's see. It might be like a really elementary kind of uh, it might be like a really elementary kind of um, uh, process, right? Like it might be a really elementary method in like computational neuroscience or systems neuroscience. So they might not even explain how they do it here. Um, so the somatic membrane potential. So yeah, I mean, maybe they have like microscopic electrodes or something. Membrane capacitance. Yeah, I'm sure you can measure like the capacitance and like voltage on like individual cell membranes. I'm pretty sure. So maybe that's literally just how they're doing it. They uh they use like these microscopic electrodes. Um and then yeah, they literally just put these microscopic electrodes on the on like certain parts of the neuron, and then they're able to measure uh like the voltage and whatnot. I think that probably
So
explains.
do they just like stick it in the rat's brain?
Oh, this is like in vitro. Like I don't think this is in the brain. I mean, wait, is it? I'm pretty sure this is. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is just like in a petri dish almost. Yeah,
Ah, I see.
yeah. Brain Engineers also does stuff that's sort of like this. It's super interesting. Yeah, I wish Kate were here. She would probably talk about how some of this relates to her kind of research work. But yeah, that's basically what they do, where they measure like activations of individual neurons and stuff in like in vitro, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I think that's how they basically do it here. Yeah, cool. Any other questions that came to your guys' mind while we were covering that about any of this? The ideas again are pretty simple in this one, but again, I think like we can take a look at the other one, right? Just real quick. This one I do think it would have been sort of a leap because it talks a lot about these. Yeah, it goes really in depth on like the learning functions and whatnot. So, like we should have comfortability with. We should be comfortable with each of these learning algorithms before we dive in to actually like comparing them and whatnot. So like, yeah, I mean, I need to like brush up and like understand this like all this notation and whatnot. But yeah, this is like a decently math heavy paper. It's not like proofs or anything, of course, but it still is pretty important to understand the math here, to understand how each of these algorithms really are approximating the learning, like are like learning the data, or performing credit assignment. That's probably the best term here. So I mean, we can come to this one next week or in the next few weeks if you guys are still interested in it. But I do think it is going to require that everyone feels pretty comfortable with all these algorithms. But again, like the core idea in this paper, like it doesn't like it's literally just comparing all of these algorithms, right? Like difference, target propagation, and so on versus backprop, and they basically show that backprop ends up beating. Wait. Oh yeah, what? Yeah, this is the lowest, right? So this is the loss. So you should be optimizing like downwards. Um, so they show that backprop like basically beats all the other algorithms when you like hold the same amount of epochs and everything, right? When you have like 500 epochs for all of these, backprop consistently beats all the other algorithms, regardless of the task. So yeah, that's basically what they show here. The backprop is still sort of the king, and there needs to be a lot more work before we come up with like um, more biologically plausible neural nets. Yeah, cool. Okay. Unless there are any other questions, I think that's about it, guys. Thank you for coming. If you want to present at like next week's meeting or something, or you have other papers that like you want us to go over as a club, then totally let me know. Um, Otherwise, yeah, I'm really enjoying these. I hope to see you guys again at next week's meeting. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
you.
See ya.
Thanks. Bye.